So Sennheiser has been on an absolute tear lately. Now, first they came out with the HD560S, which is renowned by a lot of different people from a lot of different walks of life, including myself, for being a fantastic entry-level Sennheiser. And they've come out with a new IEM, the IE300, coming in at the $300 price point. Sort of in the middleweight division for their IEMs, and I think it's an excellent IEM, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it today. Now, before we get started, some disclosures. Full transparency here, Sennheiser did send this out for a review. I'm not being paid or asked to say anything in particular. All thoughts and opinions here are my own. Now that being said, to start off this video, I want to start with by far the biggest problem I have with this IEM, and that is going to be the stock tips that come on this thing. I could not get a good seal or good sound out of the stock tips, and I couldn't get good sound because I couldn't get a good seal. Now, as far as the tips I was using, I chose the Final Audio tips. I just really like the way those tips feel. I think you could go whatever your personal preference is here, and I was sticking with the silicone, not the foam for this particular IEM. Now, those finals are just the ones that I settled on, but I did try a number of different tips just to kind of average out the general sound signature that I was getting and trying to eliminate the tips being super prominent in how the headphone was sounding. So this was assessed mostly on various tips, but I would prefer the finals. Now that I've given this thing a major downside, let's talk about a major upside. Once you get the right tips, this is simply put the most comfortable IEM I've tried. I didn't think it was because it's kind of got this weird, somewhat angular shape. It's very slim, sort of in the body section of this. The stem isn't particularly notable for its width or its length or anything like that. I also don't typically like these hardened cables that kind of stay in one place. I actually typically dislike these actually quite actively and will steer away to another cable. Not with these. I'm not changing a thing about these. I think these are by far the most comfortable IEM that I have tried. They disappear immediately. There's like no settling period. They're just extremely comfortable, pretty low profile actually, because they're so slim. They sit pretty far in your ears that you don't have this big bulky standout thing. And another big benefit to this is I've been using this primarily with an iPhone dongle. Now the testing was done on a decent DAC and amp, but with this, I'm running this at like 50 to 60%, and I think this sounds exactly the same on this setup than it does on like a Schiit Magnus and Modius combo. So if they wanted to create an efficient IEM that sounds really good off of not that much or high quality amplification, they definitely achieved it. Okay, so let's talk about the sound signature. Right away, I think this is going to be both a very good thing for certain people and a somewhat polarizing thing for others. So what this is a warm Sennheiser headphone. Just think of it like that. Think Sennheiser tonality, like their 600 line of tonality, but just really warm. Not too much treble response, but excellent bass response. And I actually think the bass response for this particular headphone is the most standout feature and is actually the thing that I would most advise buying it for, is if you like bass response. Now, the funny thing is that I'm comparing it to the 600 line of headphones, but I'm emphasizing the bass response, which the 600 line of headphones are not known for. And that's because despite the more darker shift to the overall sound signature that this has, I still find that the mid-range and the general tones of everything is extremely familiar to that line. And I don't know how they've achieved such a different classification of not only driver materials and driver types, but also a completely different classification of headphones being an IEM. And yet there's crossover and you can tell that they're in the same family. This to me is an extremely impressive IEM, and I've been waiting for an IEM like this that sounds like that for a very long time. Now, what you're not gonna get is quite the power of the vocals of something like a 6XX or a 600 series. You're not gonna quite get that, but you're gonna get, 85% there. It's gonna sound really awesome, and in my opinion, tonally, much more inviting than a lot of IEMs, especially of different brands at this price that I have personally tried. Especially when you go to a lot of the lower end stuff that has really good detail, pretty good bass response, like the tins and the KZs and stuff like that. Those have very beneficial features to them, but they don't have the tonality that this has, and that's a big upside for me. So a little bit more on the bass response here. The bass response is awesome. It's strong, very strong, and in fact, one of the strongest Sennheiser headphones I've tried, even within the full headphone size. It's quite intense. But what I actually like about this is the strange texture and sense that you get with it. So the quickest and easiest comparison that I could kind of draw this to is The difference between like a drums bass, like a large drum with a big stick that you're smacking is going boom, boom. And then like electronic bass. The electronic bass can cover a wider frequency range. It can be extremely consistent. It can be extremely fast. It's not going to be bloated in any particular way or boxy sounding, but it sounds artificial. And it's almost too perfect. It's in that realm of like, yes, this is bass. It sounds incredibly clear, great texture, but it's artificial sounding. This has a very naturalistic, non-artificial sound signature to it. It does come with a little bit of drawbacks though. It's not all benefits, unfortunately. It's a little bit boxy, a tiny bit, not a ton, but a little bit. Now I do say it's boxy, but if you really look at this price range for the bass response of like strong bass performing headphones, you're not really gonna get super clear and super strong bass response until you hit much higher up in price. So I am gonna kind of knock it from a more objective point of view, but from my experience, this is pretty typical performance for a bass IEM around this price point. So not going too hard on it. Mid-range is primarily warm sounding. It's not super clinical. You're not going to be getting a ton of like upper end frequencies for the most part, with one exception. I'll talk about that in a second. This is going to be an easy listening IEM. I wouldn't really use this for anything super technical or clinical. I personally don't think it's good for professional monitoring applications, but almost none of the IEMs that are listed as IEMs are, few exceptions. But if you're purchasing this just to listen to your music and chill out, I think it's great. I'm really happy with this. Now that one exception I was talking about comes in the form of very specific vocalists, and I can only find one that triggered it consistently. And I'm not sure if it has to do with the way it's recorded or the specific frequencies of his voice, but The Weeknd actually has this kind of upper range in his like S's and T's. They're way more forward than every other vocalist for some reason. I will even go to albums and tracks that I know are particularly sibilant, and this glides smoothly right over it. So something about the frequency or the pitch or something is just kind of upsetting this headphone with The Weeknd specifically, and artists who sound very, very similar to his kind of vocal timbre kind of upset this headphone. I'm not sure exactly what frequency it's at. I don't have an IEM measuring kit. I'd perhaps look around the internet to see if you could find measurements of this, and maybe that might explain it. But yeah, that was one artist that caused specific issues consistently with it that I should draw attention to here. Okay, so treble response being a darker headphone is obviously a little bit darker. It's not super forward. Again, not really a super technical, clinical sounding IEM. Very easygoing. This actually reminds me a lot of the treble forwardness of the Odyssey line of headphones. Not really so much in tonality, just it's not extremely forward, but you still get a decent amount of texture and information in that area, but you're not getting a ton of top end information, not a ton of air. So don't expect that. The imaging and sound staging is pretty good. This really depends on the ear tips though. Some ear tips responded better with sound staging, and others felt a little bit more vague and not as specific as some other ear tips did. I actually found that not only were the finals more comfortable for me, but they actually sounded the best and had the most upsides and the least amount of downsides. It cleaned up the bass a little bit compared to some other ear tips. Sound staging was a little bit wider and more specific than some other ear tips. So I would say if you're not getting what you want, switch the tips around and see if you can kind of tailor this thing to sound a little bit better towards your preferences. Okay, I know to most people looking at this question is going to seem kind of silly, but there is people who are going to ask me it, so I'm just going to answer it ahead of time. Should you get this or a full-size headphone from Sennheiser like a 6XX or 560S? I think it depends. I still think that the full-size headphones sound better, but they're a whole lot less convenient. And when you go with something like a 6XX, you basically really want to get amplification to get the most out of that headphone. So your barrier to entry and for cost goes up a little bit. This is just fine off of a phone, and it's obviously mobile, and it's in a completely different classification of headphones being an IEM. As a broader discussion here, I don't really think any of the major players that make both good headphones and good IEMs have their IEMs outperforming their headphones at equivalent prices. And this is no exception to that. But for a $300 IEM, is this a good IEM? I'd say absolutely. I think the tonality and texture of voices and the bass response is unique, and I haven't really seen it before on any IEM at any price. It's not my absolute favorite IEM ever at any price, but it's a very good example of an IEM at this price range. And I would have no problems recommending it to somebody who really wants just something that just sounds enjoyable above technical. All right, that's going to wrap it up for me. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Sennheiser, for sending this out for a review. And until the next time, my name is Josh, signing off.